Septum primum. At the end of 4th week, a septum primum starts developing from the roof of the primitive atrium on the left side of septum spurium and sinoatrial opening. Foramen, ostium, primum. Septum primum grows toward AV cushions, septum intermedium, and becomes a sickle-shaped septum. A small gap between the growing septum primum and septum intermedium is called foramen primum. Foramen secundum. Finally, septum primum fuses with AV cushions, closing the foramen primum. Simultaneously, a small gap called foramen secundum appears in the septum primum. Septum secundum. A crescent-shaped septum secundum starts growing from the roof of the primitive atrium between septum spurium and septum primum. Foramen oval. The septum secundum grows toward the septum intermedium and overlaps the foramen secundum. Overlapping septum secundum converts the foramen secundum into an oblique passage called foramen oval. Foramen oval is converted into a valve by opposition of the thick flap of septum secundum over the thin mobile flap of septum primum. This valve allows transmission of blood from the right atrium to the left atrium, but blood cannot re-enter the right atrium. Thus, the foramen oval allows blood to bypass pulmonary circulation and shunts most of the blood from the right atrium to the left atrium instead of the right ventricle. After birth. Immediately after birth, pulmonary circulation begins and the volume of blood returning to the left atrium increases. This raises left atrial pressure and produces physiological closure of the foramen oval. Later it closes anatomically. After birth, the foramen oval obliterates. In the adult heart, the floor of the fossa ovalis represents the septum primum, whereas the lower free margin of the septum secundum forms the annulus ovalis. Muscular part. It grows from the floor of the bulboventricular cavity and divides ventricles into two halves, grows toward septum intermedium, AV cushion, and fuses partially with it. Bulbar part. From conus cordis, the right and left bulbar ridges develop and later fuse to form a bulbar part of the septum. Bulbar part grows caudally toward the muscular part of the interventricular septum, conus septum. Membranous part. By the 8th week, the gap of the interventricular foramen is filled by tissue that proliferates from the right side of the AV cushions and the right and left bulbar ridges forms the membranous part. Presence of the interventricular foramen is essential until separation of the bulbus cordis and truncus arteriosus. Ventricular septal defects, VSD, definition. VSD involving the membranous or muscular portion of the septum. It results from the failure of fusion of the right and left bulbar ridges with the AV cushions. Tetralogy of Fallot. The most frequently occurring abnormality of the conotruncal region is due to an unequal division of the conus resulting from anterior displacement of the conotruncal septum. Displacement of the septum produces 4 cardiovascular alterations. Pulmonary artery stenosis. VSD. Overriding of the aorta. Hypertrophy of the right ventricle. Development of genital ducts. The genital ducts of the male include vasa efferentia, duct of epididymis, vas deferens, and ejaculatory duct. Female include fallopian tubes, uterus, and vagina. Initially, two pairs of genital ducts develop in both sexes. Mesonephric, Wolffian, ducts. Paramsonephric, Mullerian, ducts. In males, the mesonephric ducts form the definitive genital ducts, while the paramsonephric ducts mostly disappear. In females, the paramsonephric ducts form the female genital ducts, while the mesonephric ducts mostly disappear. Fetal circulation. Oxygenated blood from the placenta comes to the fetus through the umbilical vein with oxygen and nutrients. Oxygen-rich blood reaching the right atrium through the inferior vena cava. Most of it passes through the foramen oval to the left atrium and then to the left ventricle and aorta. 3. Fetal shunts. 1. Ductus venosus. 2. Foramen oval. 3. Ductus arteriosus. Development of kidney. Developmental stages of kidney. Pronephros. Cervical. Beginning of 4th week. Non-functional. Disappears. 2. Mesonephros. Thoracolumbar. End of 4th week. Functions for a short period and disappears. 3. Metanephros. Sacral. Beginning of 3rd month. Functional. Kidney development. The kidneys develop from two sources. Metanephric diverticulum uretic bud, which gives rise to ureter. Renal pelvis. Major and minor calyxes. Collecting tubules. The uretic bud is an outpouching from the mesonephric duct near its entrance into the cloaca. The proximal part of the uretic bud gives rise to the ureter. Metanephrogenic blastema, caudal part of the nephrogenic cord, which gives rise to the secretory portion of the nephrons. Ascent of kidney. At first, the kidneys are located in the pelvis, but they gradually ascend to the abdomen. Development of urinary bladder. The bladder develops mainly from the vesicle part of the urogenital sinus. The trigone is derived from the caudal ends of the mesonephric ducts. The entire epithelium of the bladder is derived from the endoderm of the vesicle part. The other layers of the bladder wall develop from splanchnic mesenchyme. Derivatives of the ducts. Mesonephric, Wolffian, ducts right-pointing arrow epididymis and vas deferens. Paramsonephric, Mullerian, ducts right-pointing arrow uterus and uterine tubes. Nephron formation. The cells of the metanephros form the metanephric blastema. The cells of the metanephric blastema, when they come in contact with each collecting tubule, condense around it to form a solid clump of cells called the metanephric cap. Each metanephric cap is soon converted into a vesicle called the metanephric vesicle. The metanephric vesicle first becomes a pear-shaped vesicle, which soon forms an S-shaped tubule, called the primitive renal tubule. The proximal end of the S-shaped tubule is narrow and abuts on the collecting tubule. The distal dilated end of this tubule forms Bowman's capsule. It becomes invaginated by a tuft of capillaries to form the renal glomerulus. The renal glomerulus develops from angioblastic tissue of the nephrogenic cord. The primitive renal tubule eventually forms the nephron, excretory unit, consisting of glomerular, Bowman's capsule. Proximal convoluted tubule, PCT, loop of Henle. Distal convoluted tubule, DCT. Each distal convoluted tubule joins with the collecting tubule derived from the uretic bud to form the uriniferous tubule. Intraembryonic coelom, IEC. Intraembryonic coelom is a fluid-filled cavity formed within the lateral plate mesoderm during the third week of embryonic development. The cavity is horseshoe-shaped. It consists of two halves on either side, which are joined together cranial to the prochordal plate. At first, it is a closed cavity, but later it communicates with the extraembryonic coelom. With the formation of the lateral mesoderm, the lateral plate mesoderm is divided into two layers. Somatopleuric layer forms the embryonic body wall. Splanchnopluric layer forms the walls of the embryonic gut. Derivatives of IEC. Pericardial cavity, pleural cavity, peritoneal cavity. The heart is formed in the splanchnopluric mesoderm, forming the floor of the pericardial part of the coelom. This region is called the cardiogenic plate. Cranial to the cardiogenic plate, the somatopleuric and splanchnopluric mesoderm are continuous with each other. This unsplit intraembryonic mesoderm forms the septum transversum, which develops into the diaphragm and part of the liver. Neurulation, the process of formation of the neural plate and neural folds and closure of these folds to form the neural tube is called neurulation. Formation of neural tube. At the beginning of the third week of development, the midline central part of the ectoderm above the developing notochord thickens to form the neural plate. Elevation of the edges of the neural plate forms neural folds, and the central depressed part forms the neural groove. Elevation of the neural folds continues, and they start fusing in a craniocaudal direction to form the neural tube. Cranial and caudal neuropores are the last parts to close. Umbilical cord, a tubular cord by which the fetus is connected with the placenta, allowing the exchange of nutrients, gases, and waste products. Develops from extraembryonic mesoderm, connecting stalk, at the caudal end of the embryo. The umbilical cord is covered by an amniotic membrane.